Well, welcome everyone to the introduction to Section 7 of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act training. My name is Steve Chesterton. I am the USDA Forest Service Wild and Scenic Rivers National Program Manager based in Washington, D.C. And I'll turn it over to our co-presenters, Becky and Susan, to introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Becky Blanchard. I'm a Wilderness and Wild and Scenic Rivers Specialist in the Forest Service's Pacific Southwest region.
And I'm Susan Roseborough. I work with the National Park Service Hydropower Assistance Program and am also the Regional Coordinator for the Pacific West region of the Park Service.
Thanks, Becky and Susan. And thank you all for joining today to watch this recording. We're going to try to make it as interactive as possible. And this training is based on content developed through the partnership between the Interagency Wild and Scenic Rivers Coordinating Council and the RMS River Training Center. And the focus of the training is on, as the name implies, Section 7 of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. We're not going to go into a lot of background material on the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act generally and its history or the various provisions of it. Hopefully you had an opportunity earlier in the symposium to attend the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act 101 training session or otherwise have some familiarity with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, because during this training we're really going to hone in still at an introductory level, but really with a focus on one particular section of the Act, Section 7 of the Act, and understanding the scope and intent of that and when it applies to proposed projects. We're also going to explore the different standards to apply to evaluate proposed projects when Section 7 requirements are triggered, and those standards determinations regarding the possible effects on wild and scenic river values. And then lastly, we'll talk about some of the various outcomes when a Section 7 analysis and determination is completed to evaluate a proposed project. So at that background level, looking at the intent of Section 7 of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, it really is focused on protecting the free-flowing condition and other river values of certain rivers by prohibiting any new FERC hydropower projects on those rivers, as well as providing protection from potentially harmful effects of what are referred to as water resources projects. And we'll talk in more detail about what that term means a little bit later. So this section of the Act specifically applies both to designated rivers, designated wild and scenic rivers, as well as congressionally authorized wild and scenic study rivers. And it provides an outright prohibition on the licensing of any new hydropower facilities by the FERC, or the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And then for those other water resources projects, federally assisted water resources projects, there's a determination requirement of the applicable federal river administering agency to apply the standards in order to determine how the project could potentially affect river values. It's important to note, if you have familiarity with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, Wild and Scenic River designation, that there's 3 different classifications: wild, scenic, and recreational, that describe the level of development in the river corridor at the time of designation. And that classification actually has no effect on the Section 7 process that we'll be talking about today. So we'll mention that again, but something to keep in mind as we go. So when does Section 7 apply? It doesn't apply to all projects or all activities in or on a wild and scenic river. It's only in certain scenarios. And so we're going to talk through a couple different factors to help you determine if Section 7 is the appropriate provision to apply to given activities or projects. And before we go into those factors, just want to highlight some resources that we'll be referencing throughout this training that are available on rivers.gov. In particular, the Interagency Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Council's technical paper on Section 7 and accompanying flowchart. And you've got a QR code there that you can scan with your phone to go directly to what's called the project review page of rivers.gov to access those and other materials related to Section 7. So looking at the first factor to determine if Section 7 applies, it's the status of the river in question where a project is proposed. And Section 7 only applies if the proposed project is on a designated wild and scenic river, which can be done by Congress under Section 3A of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, or by the Secretary of Interior through a petition from a state governor under Section 2A II. It also applies to rivers that have been authorized by Congress for study under Section 5 of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Importantly, where it does not apply are to other agency study rivers that are identified through Section 5 of the Act. These are also considered study rivers, but not congressionally authorized study rivers that would trigger a Section 7 application. And again, Section 7 applies regardless of the classification of the segment in question, whether it is a designated river or a congressionally authorized study river. And this just summarizes what I previously stated when Section 7 applies, when it does not apply. It's important to note for those agency authorized study rivers under 5D1, even though Section 7 doesn't apply, there may be various agency policies under the Park Service or Forest Service or Bureau of Land Management or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that do apply and may require some level of analysis or evaluation. Not required under Section 7, but could be required under agency policies. So the second factor relevant to Section 7 application is, does the project involve federal assistance? And the key terminology there is, what does federal assistance mean? Because that is a requirement in order for Section 7 to apply. And it can come in a variety of forms, whether it be permits or funding, loans or grants, licenses, or other federal technical assistance. And this broadens, creates a broad application for Section 7 on wild and scenic rivers, and can therefore apply regardless of the land ownership on which the project is proposed, because if there is that federal connection in particular, through permits or funding or other assistance, then it can still apply even if it's not taking place on federal land. So some more details on different types of federal assistance. FERC authorization of a project, a permit issued by the Army Corps of Engineers, federal funding of state highway projects is another example. And it might go without saying, but federal assistance is also triggered if it's a federal agency that's implementing the project. that would also qualify as federal assistance and application of Section 7. But if none of those criteria are met, if there's no federal assistance, then Section 7 is not required. It's not a triggered requirement under the Act. So then we go to the third factor, and that's the project location relative to a stream segment. And importantly, you want to be thinking about whether the project is located within a designated segment of a wild and scenic river or within a congressionally authorized study river corridor. If that's not the case, what's also relevant is whether the project is located upstream, downstream, or on a tributary to one of those types of rivers, a designated wild and scenic river or a congressionally authorized study river. And if the answer to those first two questions within factor 3 is no, then Section 7 would not apply. But if the answer to either of those two locations is yes, Section 7 could apply if all the other factors are met. And it's going to be important to note which of the locations the answer is yes to, whether it's within a designated or study river or upstream, downstream, or on a tributary, because that will inform the evaluative standard that will be used, which Becky will talk about in a little bit. Fourth factor is the project a hydroelectric project licensed by FERC? And we'll talk in more details about that. And then the last factor is this project what's considered a water resources project? And ultimately, what's considered a water resources project is a project that involves construction activities below the ordinary high water mark of the stream. And there are Forest Service regulations that describe that definition in more detail. But for purposes here, it really comes down to those construction activities below the ordinary high water mark. We utilize Army Corps of Engineers definitions and publications to further explain what ordinary high water mark means. For the purposes of this training, general rule of thumb is, will any part of the construction activity, any part of the project get wet through the normal range of stream flows? If yes, then it would be below the ordinary high water mark of the stream. So we've got a number of different examples of projects below the ordinary high water mark. Obviously, any in-stream work, any work within the bed and banks of the river, a variety of different projects ranging from bank stabilization, boat ramps, stream restoration projects, whitewater parks, etc. So now we're going to pivot to a participant exercise portion. I'm going to go through a number of different scenarios and then ask you to pause the recording and get some audience feedback on whether you think this scenario qualifies as a water resources project. So the first example we have here is the proposal for a new boat ramp on a designated wild and scenic river that is a recreational classification. That segment of the wild and scenic rivers is considered a recreational classification. And this is a new boat ramp intended to reduce stream bank erosion caused by the current use of dirt roads and trails for access to the river's edge. The construction activities involved here would be below the ordinary high water mark. So would this be considered a water resources project? If you can pause the recording and take a moment to discuss if this would be a water resources project? And if so, or if not, why? Then restart the recording after you've discussed, and the answer to that question is yes. This would be a water resources project because key factor here is that it's below the ordinary high water mark of the designated river. I mentioned the project's purpose is obviously promote recreational use, reduce environmental impacts. That's not a consideration for whether it's a water resources project, nor is the river's classification as recreational. That doesn't change Section 7 requirements or the determination of water resources project. So our next example is a fisheries habitat improvement project on a congressionally authorized study river, where the managing agency has identified fisheries as a key value, outstanding and remarkable value, or a potential outstanding and remarkable value. And so a project's been proposed to improve channel complexity, create some pools and riffles for coho habitat through in-stream rock weir placement below the ordinary high water mark. Is this a water resource project? Please pause and discuss. And the answer is yes. This is a water resource project because it's within a congressionally authorized study river, within the river below the ordinary high water mark. Again, other factors about the intent of the project don't matter for determinations of whether it's considered a water resources project. Our next example is a fuels reduction project. So the River Managing Agency is proposing to complete a hazardous fuels reduction project adjacent to a designated river corridor. Part of the project would occur within the designated corridor itself, but not below the ordinary high water mark. So all activities would be above the ordinary high water mark. Is this a water resources project? Pause and discuss and resume once you've had a chance to discuss and answer. And the answer is no, this would not be considered a water resources project because while the project is on a designated river corridor, it's not below the ordinary high water mark. There's no construction activities below the ordinary high water mark, therefore not a water resources project. That doesn't mean that there's not any potential wild and scenic river implications, that you wouldn't want the wild and scenic river manager or specialists focused on the wild and scenic river involved in this project to analyze potential impacts, but Section 7 would not be triggered by this project. Our last example is a bridge replacement. The state highway agency on this river is proposing to replace an old bridge that crosses over a designated wild and scenic river. As part of the replacement project, the current bridge piers and abutments below the ordinary high water mark of the river would be removed, and a new bridge will cross the river without any in-stream supports. So would this be considered a water resources project? Pause and then resume once you've had a chance to discuss. And the answer is yes, this is a water resources project. And importantly, because it's within a designated river corridor and the removal activities of the existing piers and abutments would be considered construction activities below the ordinary high water mark. So hopefully those examples have given you some good familiarity with the water resources project's terminology. Next, Becky will go into more detail on the various evaluative standards that apply under Section 7. Becky?
Thanks, Steve. So now that you know what a water resources project is, we'll talk about how to evaluate a proposed water resources project and specifically the standards from Section 7 of the Act that you would use in an evaluation. Steve, it appears that I'm not able to advance the slides. Would you be willing to move the slide forward, please?
Do that.
Thank you.
No problem.
Thanks. So there are 4 possible standards that you could use in an evaluation. The standard that you would choose for a particular project is going to be driven by the type of the project as well as the location of the project. So you'll see these standards again throughout this part of the presentation, but the 4 standards you could choose from include on or directly affecting, direct and adverse effect, invade the area or unreasonably diminish, or invade the area or diminish. These terms might not mean much to you if you're hearing them for the first time, so this section will fully explain what each of these standards are. Next slide. All of these standards originate in the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So I want to show you that language from the Act. This is the language from Section 7A that created the on or directly affecting standard. And if you take a moment just to look through it, you can see that this is a very strict standard. It applies to both designated rivers and in language that comes from Section 7B, also to congressionally authorized study rivers. So the on or directly affecting standard is an unconditional prohibition on new FERC authorized hydroelectric projects. And the language says FERC shall not license the construction of any dam, water conduit, reservoir, powerhouse, transmission line, or other project works under the Federal Power Act on or directly affecting any designated river or congressionally authorized study river. The standard has been consistently interpreted by all 4 of the river administering agencies and FERC to prohibit any project works licensed under Part 1 of the Federal Power Act within the river corridor. Next slide. So to implement this standard, you may have to make a determination as to whether a proposed project is on or directly affecting a protected corridor. So some proposed projects might be very close to, but not within the protected corridor. So it's really important to look very closely at that location. The directly affected analysis under the standard is not limited to only activities proposed below the ordinary high water mark, but it also applies to other project features like power lines and water lines that might come close to or be within the protected river corridor. And Steve, would you please click? Thank you. Policies concerning implementation of FERC projects in or adjacent to protected river corridors are really complex. So if you do encounter this in your work, if there's a proposed FERC project, please be sure to seek the advice and support of both your agencies, FERC and Wild and Scenic Rivers corridors. Next slide. So on to the second standard. This is the language from the Act that created the direct and adverse effect standard. So what's shown on the slide is from Section 7A, which applies to designated wild and scenic rivers, but there is similar language that appears in Section 7B that applies to congressionally authorized study rivers. The direct and adverse effect standard therefore applies to both designated rivers and congressional study rivers. This standard allows for the construction of appropriately designed water resources projects, and it's therefore more permissive than the prohibition on hydropower project works licensed by the FERC that we just saw in the previous standard. Next slide, please. So again, this applies to those other federally assisted water resources projects that are not FERC licensed hydropower projects that are proposed to have construction activities that would be in a wild and scenic river corridor or 5A study area. And so if you are evaluating using this standard, you would be looking to determine the effects of the proposed project on river values. That is the free-flowing condition, water quality, and specific ORVs of the river segment where the activities are located. Fortunately, the Interagency Wild and Scenic Rivers Coordinating Council technical paper that Steve highlighted earlier includes an appendix, Appendix C, that you can please click forward, Steve. Thanks. that provides questions that you would ask if you're conducting an evaluation under this standard. I think one thing to note that's really important is that if we're looking at effects to river values, we are looking at effects in terms of all of those values. There's no kind of trading off of different values. We would have to make sure that we're protecting all those values, including each of the ORVs. You couldn't have a direct and adverse effect to one ORV, but say that it's balanced out, for example, by a beneficial effect to another ORV. So really trying to be protective of each of those river values. Next slide, please. All right, our third standard, this contains the language from the Act that originated the invade the area or unreasonably diminished standard, which applies to proposed projects located above, below, or on a tributary to a designated wild and scenic river. Invade in this case means to encroach or intrude upon the protected river. Note that Congress didn't intend for a blanket prohibition on activities within the vicinity of a protected river corridor. Instead, Congress contemplated an evaluation process to ensure that these activities would not inadvertently invade or unreasonably diminish key resource values. Next slide. So for proposed FERC-licensed hydropower projects or other proposed water resources projects with federal assistance that would be located upstream, downstream, or on a tributary to a designated wild and scenic river, you would need to determine if the project encroaches on the wild and scenic river corridor. If it does, the project can't move forward unless it's modified to eliminate the effect. Note that projects such as constructing a dam downstream from a designated river have the potential to back water up into the protected wild and scenic river corridor. So that's part of this standard when we look at the word invade. So after considering encroachment, we would look at to analyze potential effects to scenery, recreation, wildlife, and fish values. And please click the slide. Thank you. You'll probably note that these 4 key resource values that Congress specified for this standard are not the same as the river values we just saw in the previous standard. Scenery, for example, may or may not be an outstandingly remarkable value for the designated wild and scenic river. Also note the word unreasonably. So there's some factors to consider related to unreasonably that really get at the magnitude of loss that would occur. For example, we would consider whether the value that would be affected contributed to the river's designation. So if scenic values would be diminished, well, is scenery one of the river's ORVs? And you'd also consider as a factor, what are the value's current conditions and trends? Appendix D of the interagency technical paper outlines the questions that you would ask if you're conducting an evaluation using this standard. Thanks. So finally, our 4th standard, invade the area or diminish. This originates from Section 7B of the Act, and it applies to congressional study rivers. You can see that the language is very close to the previous standard that we just looked at, which that standard had applied to designated wild and scenic rivers. In this case, this standard, standard 4 for congressional study rivers, does not include the modifier unreasonably or diminish. Next slide. The invade the area or diminish standard applies where the proposed project is upstream, downstream, or on a tributary to a study river corridor. In your evaluation, please click. You would need to determine if the project encroaches on the study river corridor. If not, you would then analyze effects to scenic, recreational, fish, and wildlife values to determine if they would be diminished from the condition at the time Congress had authorized the river study. So in this standard, the word diminish is not qualified by unreasonably. So by removing unreasonably, Congress is actually providing greater protection to help ensure these values are not compromised during the river's study period. So if any of these values were diminished, that could potentially preclude the river's designation. There's the potential that a project with long-term positive benefits, which greatly outweigh the very short-term diminishment of value, for example, may be determined acceptable. However, it's really important that the values that make the river eligible for future designation, they must be maintained both in the short and long term, as well as its tentative classification. And you would use Appendix E of that interagency technical paper to conduct an evaluation using the standard. Next slide. And I apologize, Steve, this is quite a quick click through. So just to summarize the 4 standards and the types of projects and project locations where each would apply, maybe I'll just ask you to click through, Steve, and I'll try to keep up the best I can. So FERC licensed hydropower facilities that are within a wild and scenic river corridor or study area, that's the on or directly affecting standard. And again, please remember that's an outright prohibition. Other types of water resources projects that are within a wild and scenic river corridor or study river area, that's the direct and adverse effects standard. You'd be looking at direct and adverse effects to river values, to free flow, water quality, and ORVs. So if we look at projects that are proposed outside a wild and scenic river corridor, if we're talking about a FERC licensed hydropower facility, the standard would be invade the area or unreasonably diminish. Similarly, if we're looking at another type of other proposed federally assisted water resource project, we would also use invade the area or unreasonably diminish. In the case of a study river, as we just discussed, the standard is similar, but that word unreasonably no longer applies. And those projects are looking just at scenic, recreational, fish, and wildlife values. Next slide. All right, so let's look at some of the water resource project examples Steve had shared earlier. I want to give you a chance to test what you just learned by identifying which standard would apply. So first, that example of a new boat ramp that would be constructed on a designated wild and scenic river. I'll ask that you think about which standard you think would apply and perhaps turn to someone sitting near you and exchange your answers. Next slide. I'll share this chart in case this helps. I'll just wait a moment. All right. So in this example of a boat ramp on a designated wild and scenic river, please click. The project is located within the corridor, and it is an other proposed federally assisted water resources project. So we would use the direct and adverse effects standard to evaluate if there are direct and adverse effects to free flow, water quality, and ORVs. Next slide. All right, let's look at this example of the fisheries habitat improvement project that would be in a congressionally authorized study river area. Which standard would apply? I'll give you just a moment to think about it and turn to a neighbor to exchange your thoughts. Next slide, please. For a project that is within a study river area, please click. That is a non-FERC, other federally assisted water resources project, you would evaluate the project for direct and adverse effects to free flow, water quality, and ORVs. All right, next slide. Which standard would you apply to evaluate the state proposal to replace a bridge that crosses a designated wild and scenic river? Give you a moment again. Thank you. The project location is within the Wild and Scenic River Corridor, and the project type is a non-FERC, other federally assisted water resources project. So this is yet another case where you would evaluate the project for direct and adverse effects to free flow, water quality, and ORVs. And let's move on to our last example. This is a new one. In this case, FERC is considering relicensing a hydropower project that is located above a designated wild and scenic river outside the corridor. Which standard would you apply? All right, the hydropower project is located above a designated wild and scenic river. It is a FERC licensed hydropower facility. So to evaluate the relicensing proposal, you would determine if the project would invade the wild and scenic river corridor or if it would unreasonably diminish scenic, recreational, fish, and wildlife values relative to their condition at designation. Now I'll turn it over to Susan.
Thanks, Becky. I'm going to try to share my screen. And it's good. Okay. Well, thanks. I'm going to bring us on the home stretch here of the presentation, and we're going to review a flowchart, which is one of the resources Steve introduced earlier, and then look at a case study on how we would apply that flowchart, and then finally talk about the outcomes, like what happens at the end of these determinations that we've been talking about how they apply. So to begin with, this is a flowchart, and just to note that this is a flowchart for water resources projects. We do have a separate flowchart that's for Federal Energy Regulatory Commission hydropower projects. And what this does is essentially a tool to walk through those factors that Steve introduced earlier. And it's kind of this yes and no questions on each of those factors to help us determine, one, does Section 7 apply? And then at the end, it also shows if it does apply, then what is that standard that Becky just went over? So the first thing is related to that federal assistance. You know, does the project involve federal assistance? And if it's not federal assistance, you know, as we were talking about earlier, then the Section 7 doesn't apply. If it is federal assistance, then one of the next factors we're looking at is that location. And this in particular is saying, is the project located in the Wild and Scenic River corridor of a designated river or a steady river? And if that's no, then we look at the other location that we talked about, upstream, downstream on a tributary. And if that's no, then Section 7 doesn't apply. If we go back to if it's in the corridor, it's federally assisted project, that's a yes. But if it's a hydro project, as we mentioned, there's another tool for that. So that goes for, depending on the location, we would be looking at another tool for those projects. But going back to if looking at these answers, we've got a federally assisted project. It's located on upstream, downstream, or on a tributary of a designated river or congressionally authorized steady river. It's not a hydropower project. The next big question and factor that we had talked about is it a water resources project? And so looking at that, using that test of, you know, would the project get wet? Is it a water resources project? If the answer is no, that factor doesn't apply, then Section 7 wouldn't apply there. Similarly, if we're looking at this, you know, the location is inside the corridor, federally assisted. If it's a water resources project, but if it's not a water resources project, it would not apply. If it is a water resources project, then we have a yes there, then we know that we have met all of those factors. We've got the federal assistance, the location is in this case inside the corridor, and we have the water resources project. So then it helps us say, yes, there is a Section 7 required, and here is the standard that we would use, the ones that Becky was just reviewing. So in this case, we've got the direct and adverse effects standard on free flow, water quality, or the outstanding remarkable values. And then going back to the other location that we were looking at, so we've got a federal assistance project. It is now located upstream, downstream, or on a tributary, and it is a water resources project. Then that helps us determine the standard for that. And in this case, we've got two potential standards based on, is it a designated river or is it a congressionally authorized steady river? So the designated rivers is the invade or reasonably diminish, recreation, scenic, wildlife, or fisheries. And then for the steady rivers, we've got a similar but invade or diminish, those four values. So this is just a tool that just helps us walk through the things that we've been talking about today. It's available on rivers.gov. Also just wanted to point out the back side of this. We're not going to go through all this, but has a lot of great definitions and links for more information. So it defines a lot of the factors that we were talking about today. I will just mention that construction piece here, defines construction as any action that could affect free flow or natural or scenic values of the river. And there's a link to the regulations here. I know that's a question that we get asked sometimes is like, well, if this is a dam removal or something that's getting removed, does construction really apply? But the definition that we have here we can see that does apply. So now we want to just walk through this case study that we have and use the flow chart to help us determine whether or not Section 7 applies and what standard would be if it does apply. And based on all that you guys have heard today, you might be able to figure that out just by hearing the case study, but we'll walk through the flow chart too. So this is on the Metolus River, which is a wild and scenic river on the Deschutes National Forest in Oregon. It's a spring-fed river. It was designated in 1988, and it has a number of outstanding remarkable values. The project here is a restoration project. So it's a restoration project for salmon. It includes placing structures within the river corridor and anchoring some to the bank. It also involves removing a log bridge, including some piers and abutments that are inside the river. The project would require a permit by the Corps, and it's located within the recreational and scenic segments of this designation. So here we have our flow chart, and we'll just kind of walk through. You guys might already know the answer based on this session, and we can kind of see if you're right. So we've got the first factor, looking at, is it a federal assistance? In this case, we know the Army Corps is involved with the permit. So we have a yes to that. The second question is about that location. Is it on a designated river inside the corridor or a steady river inside that corridor of steady? And in this case, we know that it's in those recreational and scenic segments. So that's a yes. We know that it's not a hydro project. And then our next question is it an activity, a water resources project? So in this case, we know the project's going to get wet. We know there's structures in the river, that we know things are getting removed from the river. So we have a yes here. And then that leads us right to our standard that we're going to be evaluating under, that direct and adverse standard. Okay. So next I'm going to just talk about the outcome. So we've talked a lot about, what Section 7 is, what are the factors, how it applies, what are those standards, but then we're also just going to touch on what happens at the end of these processes and what does that process look like. So the river administering agencies has these responsibilities for, under Section 7 to actually be making the determination and doing that assessment. One thing I wanted to note here is that consultation process is really important. It's meant to be an interactive process where you're working with the project proponent. In some cases, the river administrating agency may also, be the one proposing the project. So working in an interdisciplinary team to be evaluating that project. In other cases, there might be an outside entity, transportation department, the Army Corps, other groups that are proposing projects. So the idea is through this consultation process to be able to understand what those river values are and the standard, and be able to see what ways can we influence the design to reduce those effects to the river. and be able to protect and enhance the rivers, these special rivers that are designated. In the end, after that assessment is done, there is a determination that's done by the leadership. I know in the Park Service, that's the regional director, and each agency has their own, person that signs these determinations. So what are those possible pieces that could come out of this? And I think as we were sharing earlier, this result is kind of, is it consistent with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, or is it not? So the different options here, kind of the no-go option is it doesn't meet those standards. The adverse effects are to the point where it doesn't meet those standards. So that means that that project can't move forward as is. We'll talk a little bit about options to move ahead with that type of project in a minute here. The other thing that can occur is, yeah, we have some adverse effects that have been documented. It doesn't meet the standard as is, but there are some different ways that we can do to avoid or eliminate those effects. And that could be, as big as maybe a different design, different size, scope of the project. It could be as small as maybe some best management practices to reduce turbidity and things like that. So there's a range of things that can happen, but the whole idea is that there would be reducing those effects so that then it would meet the standard if we can condition those elements to the determination. And then lastly, you've got a project that's, you did the evaluation and it's, it's a green light, it looks good. We don't have those, it meets that standard, doesn't have those adverse effects. The other thing just to touch on, because, different laws are written differently, and the Wild and Scenic River law in particular what we lean towards is this avoidance versus mitigation. So other laws, as I'm sure you guys all know, NEPA and the Endangered Species Act look at mitigation and how can we mitigate effects, different ways to do that. And the thing with Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is the whole system was set aside as mitigation to all of the dam building and water resources projects that were happening at the time, channelization, all these different things were happening to the rivers, and Congress wanted to set aside these rivers forever, for all of us forever. And because of that, we can't have these river values that they were set aside be degraded. So that's why we have this difference between avoidance and mitigation measures in the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And under the act, we can avoid, we can eliminate, we can do that with these measures and conditions that we can put on the determination, or work collaboratively with project proponents to have the project be designed in a way that fits the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. But we can't mitigate, and we can't have, different mitigation funds or offsite mitigation that would be elsewhere that doesn't count for the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act just because of that intention of the act itself. And while we definitely can do different measures, and that's the goal, is to have some measures that would reduce those effects, if it's still to the point of like, hey, this doesn't reduce them, but it still doesn't meet the standard, then that's still an issue and we're ending up in that red light scenario. So what happens if we do end up there? We've tried our best, we've worked with a project proponent or ourselves on that design, and we end up with a project that doesn't meet the standard. Well, there is a process that's outlined that you can go through if the federal assisting agency would like to move ahead with a project. Then they do need to notify the relevant secretary of the river administering agency in 60 days in advance, and then they also need to provide a request to Congress to authorize or appropriate funds. And we are aware of, there may be more, but I am aware of one project where this happened, and that's on the St. Croix, pictured here, where the Park Service had found that it didn't meet the standard. This was a new bridge project that was being proposed, and would have a number of impacts, and scenic impacts in particular. And it was found to not meet that standard, and Congress, they provide that notification, and then Congress did end up providing additional authorization for the project to move ahead. So the whole foresight of these evaluations is really to help improve and protect these river values that we have. And there can be a lot of positive outcomes just going through that consultation process and that evaluation process that we've been talking about can identify different ways to, to keep that protection and enhancing the river values at the forefront. Some examples could be, doing some different designs. A project could use bioengineering instead of harder stabilization methods. For bridge projects, you might have a bridge project that spans the whole width of the river. So there's a lot of different ways we can look at positive outcomes for the river through going through this thought process that the Section 7 provides and working collaboratively with the project proponents and partners. So some projects just are restoration projects that provide these positive outcomes for the river. This is one example of that on the Trinity River. On the picture on the left, you can see that the river segment here was channelized and that was impacting the Najamis fishery, which is the only outstanding remarkable value in this case. And so there was a restoration project, and you can see the picture on the right that shows new meanders and gravel bars and improved habitat for the Najamis fish. Another example is this Bancroft Bridge replacement, and this is, I think, a pretty common project that can happen on a wild and sick river where you've got an existing bridge. You can see the picture on the left where you've got the piers, then abutments inside the river corridor affecting the free flow. And you can see the picture on the right where you've got the new design and replacement was really to span that whole river width so you could allow that river to be free flowing. And they also did some measures to have it blend in more with the environment for the scenic perspective. So those are just some examples of just ways this Section 7 evaluation process and these different things as we're thinking about the designations can help improve the values. So just to summarize what we went over today, we've started with just reviewing the intention of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and it's really that foresight that Congress had when putting this section together, recognizing that the intention of these acts is to protect and enhance these river values, but there could be in future projects, water resources projects, hydropower projects that could affect the river. And so wanting to ensure that the free flowing character of these rivers remained. And then we also looked at those factors in terms of when Section 7 applies and when it doesn't apply. And that includes the federal assistance, looking at the location of the project, looking at, is it on a designated river? Is it a congressionally authorized steady river? And looking also at those types of projects. Is it a water resources project? Is it a Federal Energy Regulatory Commission hydropower project? All of those factors. And then based on those factors, looked at what are those different standards that would apply given the location, the type of project, and if it's designated or a steady river. And then finally, we touched on the outcomes and recognized that, there are some potential outcomes there. Hopefully we've got that green light where we're meeting that standard. There's also an option where we didn't meet the standard, but we can place and work with the proponents to have some conditions and reduction measures that will help us meet that standard. And then finally looking at projects that don't meet that standard and what is that process for those. Just wanted to share this resource slide again that you can link to through your phone on the QR code. There's this project review page on rivers.gov that has the flowchart that we just went over, as well as the white paper for from the console, and then also has some examples and other great things on that project review page, I should say. And with that, just wanted to thank you all for coming today and listening to us. We appreciate that. We are available by email if you wanted to connect with us with any questions or just other connections. We're sorry we couldn't join you in person, but we're grateful to have this opportunity to connect with you today.